The photograph captures a woman in an emerald silk dress standing beside a mahogany sideboard in a plantation parlor, her right hand resting on a crystal wine decanter that catches afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Elizabeth Marlowe, age 28, 5 feet 7 inches tall. Photographed on June 14, 1839, at Rosewood Plantation in Adams County, Mississippi. The decanter in the photograph holds port wine imported from Portugal, valued at $18 per bottle, served to guests in the plantation's formal entertaining rooms. In exactly 3 months, that same decanter would contain port wine laced with white arsenic powder at a concentration of 0.3 grams per serving, enough to cause death within 5 days while mimicking symptoms of cholera or malaria. Between September 1839 and August 1842, Elizabeth would fill that decanter 47 times, serving poisoned wine to 47 different men, all of whom believed they were drinking to celebrate their sexual conquest of the plantation owner's beautiful wife. September 17, 1839, 7:43 p.m. The evening heat in Adams County hung thick and oppressive, the kind of Mississippi humidity that made breathing feel like drowning in air. Elizabeth stood in her bedroom on the second floor of Rosewood's main house, wearing a cotton nightdress with nothing underneath, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, instead of pinned up as propriety demanded. Through the window, she could see the overseer's cottage, a small wooden structure 50 yards from the main house where Jonathan Pritchard lived alone. Pritchard was 32 years old, originally from Georgia, employed by Elizabeth's husband Henry to manage the 600 enslaved people who worked Rosewood's 4,800 acres of cotton fields. Pritchard carried a bullwhip on his belt every day, used it on average 3 times per week, and had beaten a pregnant woman so severely 2 months ago that she'd lost her baby. Elizabeth had been planning his death for 6 weeks. The mathematics of her situation were simple and brutal. Her husband, Henry Marlowe, was 53 years old, cruel in ways both systematic and casual, and would never grant her a divorce because women didn't divorce their husbands in Mississippi in 1839. She'd been married to him for 11 years, since she was 17 and he was 42. An arranged marriage between her merchant father and Natchez, who needed cash, and Henry, who needed social connections to expand his cotton business. 11 years of watching enslaved people beaten, raped, sold away from their families. 11 years of being Henry's property in almost the same way the 600 enslaved people were his property. The difference was that she slept in silk sheets instead of on dirt floors. But the fundamental lack of freedom was identical. Henry owned her body, her labor, her future, everything except the one thing he couldn't see or control: her mind. Elizabeth had realized something important 6 months earlier while watching Jonathan Pritchard whip a young man named Samuel for supposedly moving too slowly during cotton picking. The entire system of slavery in Adams County depended on approximately 200 white men, overseers, slave catchers, patrol riders, who maintained constant surveillance and immediate violence to control roughly 12,000 enslaved people. The ratio was 60 enslaved people for every white overseer. That meant the system was actually fragile. It depended on every overseer being present, vigilant, and willing to use violence without hesitation. Remove even a few overseers, and the surveillance gaps would widen. Remove enough overseers, and the entire system might collapse. But you couldn't just shoot overseers. That would bring investigations, military responses, mass reprisals against enslaved people. You needed deaths that looked natural, that occurred slowly enough that patterns weren't obvious, that happened to men nobody would miss too much because overseers were rough men from poor backgrounds who died from disease all the time anyway. And you needed a method of getting close enough to these men to deliver whatever would kill them. Elizabeth had 3 advantages that no enslaved person could ever have. First, she was white, which meant no white man would ever suspect her of murder. Second, she was beautiful. Genuinely beautiful in ways that made men stupid and careless. Third, she had access to white arsenic, which her husband kept in the plantation storehouse for killing rats, but which worked equally well on humans at slightly higher doses. The physics of arsenic poisoning were well understood by 1839, though not widely discussed in polite society. White arsenic, arsenic trioxide, was tasteless and odorless when dissolved in wine or spirits. A dose of 0.1 grams caused stomach pain and vomiting. A dose of 0.2 grams caused severe gastric distress that could be mistaken for food poisoning. A dose of 0.3 grams, delivered to a 180-pound man, caused symptoms that developed over 3 to 5 days: violent nausea, bloody diarrhea, severe dehydration, eventual organ failure, and death. The symptoms mimicked cholera almost perfectly. Doctors in Mississippi saw cholera deaths constantly, especially during summer months. One more death from cholera wouldn't trigger investigation. Elizabeth had been planning her approach to Jonathan Pritchard since mid-August. She'd observed his patterns, learned his schedule, discovered his weaknesses. Pritchard was unmarried, lonely, sexually frustrated after months in the countryside with no available white women. He drank heavily most evenings, sitting on his cottage porch with a bottle of whiskey. He watched the main house windows where Elizabeth sometimes appeared, silhouetted against lamplight. She'd seen him watching, had understood the hunger in his stare. Tonight, she would give him what he thought he wanted, and in the process, gain the ability to kill him whenever she chose. She left her bedroom at 7:45 p.m., walked downstairs through the main house that was empty, except for house slaves who knew better than to notice where the mistress went at night. Henry was in Natchez on business, wouldn't return until tomorrow evening. The household staff had learned long ago not to interfere with Elizabeth's movements. She'd been kind to them, had secretly taught several of them to read despite laws forbidding slave literacy, had protected them from Henry's worst impulses when possible. They would say nothing about her leaving the house, would swear they'd seen nothing if anyone asked. The walk to Pritchard's cottage took 90 seconds. Elizabeth moved through darkness between buildings, her bare feet making no sound on packed earth paths. She wore only the thin nightdress, visible as a pale shape in the darkness, but not identifiable as the plantation owner's wife, until she stepped onto Pritchard's porch and into the lamplight spilling from his window. She knocked once, soft but audible. 30 seconds passed. The door opened. Pritchard stood there in shirt and trousers, lamplight behind him, staring at Elizabeth with an expression that moved from confusion to shock to lust in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Mrs. Marlowe?" His voice was uncertain, disbelieving. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here." "If Mr. Marlowe, my husband is in Natchez," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice low and calm. "He won't return until tomorrow evening. May I come in?" She didn't wait for an answer, stepping past him into the cottage's single room. The space was crude but functional. Bed, table, 2 chairs, a small stove for cooking. It smelled of sweat, tobacco, and lamp oil. Pritchard closed the door behind her, his hands shaking slightly. Elizabeth turned to face him, letting him see her clearly in the lamplight, letting him understand that the nightdress was effectively transparent, that she wore nothing beneath it, that she was offering something he'd fantasized about but never believed possible. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the revulsion coiling in her stomach. "I find myself in a difficult situation. My marriage is unsatisfying. My husband is an old man who fails to meet certain needs. I've noticed you watching me these past weeks. I wondered if you might be interested in helping me address those needs." The words were calculated, designed to appeal to Pritchard's ego while framing the situation as her desperate hunger rather than seduction. Men like Pritchard needed to believe they were conquering rather than being manipulated. His face flushed red. His breathing accelerated. "Ma'am, this is... Mr. Marlowe would kill me if he knew I even thought about." "Then we'll ensure he never knows," Elizabeth said, stepping closer, placing her hand on Pritchard's chest. She could feel his heart hammering beneath her palm. "I'm not asking for romance, Mr. Pritchard. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me or make foolish promises. I'm simply asking if you'd like to bed me occasionally when my husband is away. In exchange, I'll make certain you're well compensated. Better whiskey, improved living conditions, perhaps a raise in your wages that I can arrange without my husband questioning the expense." Pritchard's resistance collapsed. That was the moment Elizabeth understood something crucial about human psychology. Men's sexual desire overrode every other consideration when presented with an opportunity they'd fantasized about but believed impossible. Pritchard pulled her to him, his hands rough on her body, his mouth crushing against hers. Elizabeth forced herself to respond, to pretend enthusiasm for something that made her want to vomit. The sex that followed lasted approximately 12 minutes, performed on Pritchard's crude bed with minimal preliminary affection. Elizabeth focused on making appropriate sounds, on touching him in ways that suggested passion rather than tolerance, on creating the impression that she found him satisfying, when in reality she felt nothing except determination to complete this necessary step. When it was finished, Pritchard lay beside her, breathing heavily, his ego swollen larger than his recently deflated anatomy. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "I can't believe... Mrs. Marlowe, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever..." "Call me Elizabeth when we're alone," she interrupted, sitting up and reaching for her nightdress. "And remember, this only works if you're absolutely discreet. If anyone learns about this, anyone at all, it ends immediately and you'll lose your position here. Do you understand?" Pritchard nodded eagerly. "Of course, I won't tell a soul. When can we... when would you like to meet again?" "I'll come to you when opportunities arise," Elizabeth said, pulling the nightdress over her head. "Usually when my husband travels, 2 or 3 times per month. And Mr. Pritchard, I'll bring wine next time. Good wine from my husband's cellar. We should celebrate our arrangement properly." She left the cottage at 8:17 p.m., walked back to the main house through darkness, went to her bedroom, and immediately washed herself with water from the pitcher on her dresser. The physical act with Pritchard had been necessary, but revolting. His hands had been rough, his technique selfish, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. But she'd accomplished the first critical step. She'd established a pattern that would allow her regular private access to Pritchard. She'd created a situation where she could bring him wine without suspicion, and she'd given him reason to believe this arrangement would continue indefinitely, which meant he'd never suspect when the wine she brought started containing something besides alcohol. Elizabeth retrieved a small leather journal from the locked drawer in her writing desk, one her husband had never seen and never would. She opened to a blank page and wrote in careful script, "September 17th, 1839. Pritchard, established access. Ready for implementation within 2 weeks." Below that, she wrote a number, 147. She'd calculated it would take approximately 47 overseer deaths to reduce supervision across Adams County to the point where enslaved people could escape in significant numbers. Pritchard would be the first. 46 more would follow. At a rate of 1 death per month, the campaign would take just under 4 years. By 1843, if everything worked, The slave patrol system in Adams County would be so depleted that mass escapes would become possible. The white arsenic was stored in the plantation's main storehouse, a large wooden building 50 yards behind the main house, where supplies, equipment, and chemicals were kept. Elizabeth visited the storehouse the next afternoon while Henry was still in Natchez, entering through the door that only she and her husband had keys to access. The arsenic was kept in a clearly labeled tin container on a high shelf, used regularly for rat poisoning around the plantation's food storage areas. She removed approximately 6 grams of white powder, enough for 20 doses if she used 0.3 grams per serving. The amount was small enough that nobody would notice it missing, but large enough to last through multiple uses before she needed to return for more. She transported the arsenic back to the main house, wrapped in a handkerchief, hidden in her dress pocket. In her bedroom, she transferred the powder to a small glass vial previously used for perfume, stoppered it with a cork, and hid it in the locked drawer alongside her journal. The process took 7 minutes. Nobody saw her. Even if they had, what would they think? A plantation owner's wife retrieving something from storage was unremarkable. The fact that the something was poison intended for overseers was the one detail that would never occur to anyone. Because women, especially refined, educated white women, didn't poison people. That was Elizabeth's greatest advantage. She was literally invisible as a potential murderer because her race, gender, and social class made murder unthinkable to everyone around her. September 30th, 1839. Henry left for Natchez again, a business trip expected to last 3 days. Elizabeth waited until 8 p.m., then prepared a tray carrying the crystal wine decanter, 2 glasses, and a bottle of port from Henry's wine cellar. She'd opened the port that afternoon, letting it breathe as expensive wine was supposed to. Into the decanter, she'd poured the port along with 0.3 grams of white arsenic, measured carefully using a small balance scale she'd borrowed from the plantation's cotton weighing room. The arsenic dissolved completely, left no visible residue, produced no smell. The port's deep red color concealed any potential slight cloudiness from the powder. The resulting mixture was indistinguishable from pure wine, except for one detail. Anyone who drank a full glass would be dead within 5 days. She walked to Pritchard's cottage at 8:12 p.m., carrying the tray, knocked on his door, smiled when he opened it with an expression of delighted surprise. "I brought wine," she said simply, stepping inside. "I thought we might share a drink before other activities." Pritchard's cottage had been cleaned since her last visit, his crude attempt at making it more suitable for entertaining the woman he believed was his secret lover. Elizabeth poured 2 glasses of port, handed one to Pritchard, kept the other for herself. She raised her glass in a toast. "To discretion," she said, "and to satisfying arrangements that benefit us both." Pritchard clinked his glass against hers, drank deeply. Elizabeth raised her own glass to her lips, but didn't swallow. Just wet her lips with wine, then set the glass down while Pritchard's attention was focused elsewhere. He finished his glass quickly, appreciating good wine the way men from poor backgrounds always did, gulping it like cheap whiskey rather than sipping it. Elizabeth refilled his glass immediately, encouraging him to drink more while she pretended to sip from her own glass that remained nearly full. The poison required only 1 full glass to deliver a fatal dose, but 2 glasses made success more certain. By 8:45 p.m., Pritchard had consumed approximately 9 ounces of poisoned port wine, more than enough arsenic to kill him several times over. He was also slightly drunk, which made the sex that followed even briefer and more mechanical than the first time. Elizabeth endured it, focusing on the fact that this man who was currently grunting on top of her would be dead within a week. That he would never rape another enslaved woman, never swing his whip again, never contribute to the surveillance network that kept 600 people in bondage at Rosewood alone. She left Pritchard's cottage at 9:27 p.m. carrying the empty tray with the wine decanter and glasses. She washed the glasses thoroughly in her bedroom, rinsed the decanter 3 times with clean water, destroyed any evidence that poison had ever been present. The wine bottle with its remaining poisoned contents she poured into the chamber pot in her bedroom, then flushed it with water. By 10 p.m., every trace of the poisoned wine was gone, except for the approximately 0.3 grams of white arsenic, currently dissolving in Jonathan Pritchard's stomach, beginning its work of destroying his internal organs cell by cell. Pritchard became ill on October 2nd, exactly 48 hours after drinking the poisoned wine. He complained of stomach pains to the plantation's head field supervisor, was advised to rest and drink water. By October 3rd, he was vomiting continuously and had developed bloody diarrhea. A doctor was summoned from Natchez on October 4th, examined Pritchard, and diagnosed cholera based on the symptoms. The doctor recommended keeping Pritchard isolated, providing him with water and laudanum for pain, and waiting to see if he recovered. Most cholera cases either resolved within a week or killed within 10 days. Pritchard died on October 6th at 3:47 a.m., 9 days after drinking poisoned port wine in his cottage while believing he was having an affair with his employer's wife. The funeral was brief. Overseers weren't important enough for elaborate ceremonies. Pritchard was buried in a simple pine coffin in the plantation's workers' cemetery, a plot of land set aside for white employees and their families. Henry Marlowe attended the funeral, expressed regret about losing a competent overseer, immediately began recruiting a replacement. Elizabeth attended as well, wearing black mourning clothes as propriety demanded, her face arranged in an expression of polite concern appropriate for someone grieving a household employee. Nobody suspected her involvement. Why would they? Cholera killed people constantly in Mississippi. Jonathan Pritchard's death was tragic but unremarkable, one of dozens that would occur in Adams County that summer alone. Elizabeth returned to her bedroom after the funeral and added a second entry in her locked journal. October 6, 1839. Pritchard deceased. Cause attributed to cholera. No investigation. Method successful. Proceeding. Below that, she updated her count. 147 complete. 46 remaining. She calculated that at her current pace of 1 death per month, she would complete the operation by June 1843. 46 more men would die. 46 more sexual encounters she would endure, performing intimacy with men she despised while delivering poison disguised as wine. The prospect was exhausting but necessary. Every dead overseer was one less whip, one less pair of eyes watching for escapes, one less man enforcing the system that kept 12,000 people in chains across Adams County. Henry hired a replacement overseer named Marcus Webb on October 19th. Webb was 28 years old, originally from South Carolina, experienced in managing large slave labor forces on cotton plantations. He moved into Pritchard's cottage, took over management of Rosewood's field workers, and within 2 weeks had established himself as even more brutal than his predecessor. Elizabeth watched him work for 3 weeks, learning his patterns, identifying his vulnerabilities. Webb was married, but his wife lived in South Carolina. A long-distance marriage maintained through occasional letters. He was lonely, isolated, susceptible to the same approach that had worked on Pritchard. On November 14th, Elizabeth knocked on his cottage door at 8:37 p.m. carrying a wine tray. Webb opened the door, saw the plantation owner's wife standing in lamplight, wearing a thin dress, and his resistance lasted approximately 40 seconds before collapsing under the weight of opportunity and desire. The pattern repeated: sex, wine, poison, death. Webb died on November 23rd, after 9 days of illness attributed to malaria. which was also common in Mississippi and produced symptoms similar to arsenic poisoning. His replacement, a man named David Foster, was hired on December 2nd. Elizabeth seduced him on December 18th. Foster died on December 27th. His replacement, Thomas Klein, was hired on January 9th, 1840. Elizabeth poisoned him on January 24th. Klein died on February 1st. The operation was accelerating. Elizabeth had refined her technique, learned the optimal timing for seduction and poisoning, discovered that men's resistance evaporated almost instantly when presented with sexual access to a beautiful woman who seemed desperate for their attention. By March 1840, 5 overseers had died at Rosewood Plantation in 6 months. An unusual but not completely unprecedented mortality rate, given that cholera, malaria, yellow fever, and other diseases killed white men regularly in the Mississippi Delta. Henry Marlowe was frustrated by the turnover, complained about the difficulty of finding competent overseers, but never suspected anything beyond bad luck and unfortunate disease. Elizabeth continued her journal, marking each death with a date and count. 247, 347, 447, 547. She was ahead of schedule. At her current pace, she would complete all 47 deaths by early 1842 rather than 1843. But Rosewood alone wouldn't be enough. 5 dead overseers had reduced supervision on one plantation, but Adams County contained 43 major plantations, employing approximately 200 total overseers across 12,000 enslaved people. Elizabeth needed to expand her operation beyond Rosewood, needed to target overseers on neighboring plantations, needed to spread deaths across the county so that no single plantation looked suspicious, while the aggregate effect gradually collapsed the entire surveillance system. That meant she needed to leave her own plantation, needed to attend social gatherings where she could meet overseers from other estates, needed to expand her hunting ground from one cottage to the entire county. The solution came from an unexpected source: her husband's business. Henry Marlowe belonged to the Adams County Planters Association, a group of wealthy plantation owners who met monthly to discuss cotton prices, slave management techniques, and political issues affecting their industry. These meetings rotated between different plantations, always included extensive socializing, with wives attending alongside their husbands. Henry expected Elizabeth to attend, to play the role of gracious plantation mistress, entertaining important guests. She'd always found these gatherings tedious, but now she recognized their potential. Every meeting put her in contact with overseers from multiple plantations, men who managed security, worked as drivers, supervised field hands. Men who were watching Elizabeth just as Jonathan Pritchard had watched her, hungry for something beyond their reach. The March 1840 Planters Association meeting was held at Oakmont Plantation, 6 miles north of Rosewood. Elizabeth attended wearing a blue silk dress that emphasized her figure without being scandalously revealing. She moved through the crowd of planters and their wives, making polite conversation, and observed the overseers who stood at the edges of gatherings. These men weren't invited to socialize with the plantation owners. They were present as drivers or assistants, tasked with managing the enslaved workers who served food and drinks at these events. But they were there, watching, noticing the beautiful wives of wealthy men, fantasizing about things they'd never have. Elizabeth identified 3 targets at that single gathering. Robert Nash from Oakmont Plantation, standing near the stables watching her move through the crowd. Samuel Briggs from Willowbrook Plantation 5 miles east, helping manage the teams that drove guests' carriages. And John Sullivan from Magnolia Grove 3 miles south, supervising enslaved workers who served drinks on the lawn. She memorized their faces, their builds, details about where they worked. Over the next month, she would visit each plantation on various pretexts, returning borrowed items to neighboring wives, delivering messages from her husband to other planters, making social calls that gave her opportunities to observe these men's cottages and routines. Robert Nash died on April 19, 1840. After drinking poisoned wine Elizabeth had delivered to his cottage at Oakmont during an evening when she'd told her husband she was visiting Mrs. Pemberton, the Oakmont plantation owner's wife, to discuss charitable work for the church. Samuel Briggs died on May 7th. John Sullivan died on May 24th. The deaths occurred at different plantations, separated by miles, attributed to different diseases, investigated by different doctors who had no reason to compare notes or recognize patterns. Elizabeth's journal entries multiplied. 6:47, 7:47, 8:47. She was moving faster now, sometimes killing 2 men in a single month, expanding her range across Adams County. The sexual component remained necessary, but had become almost mechanical for Elizabeth. She'd learned to dissociate during the act, to let her body go through motions while her mind focused elsewhere. The men never noticed her detachment. They were too focused on their own pleasure, too convinced that they were skillfully seducing the plantation owner's wife rather than being manipulated by her. Every encounter followed the same pattern: seduction, sex, wine, poison, death. The only variation was location and victim, but the mechanics stayed consistent. Elizabeth became efficient at it, refined her approach to minimize time spent with each man while maximizing the chances of successful poisoning. By September 1840, 13 overseers had died across Adams County in 12 months. Nash, Briggs, Sullivan, and 10 others whose names filled Elizabeth's journal in neat, careful script. The mortality rate was higher than normal, but still within the range of natural disease variation. Nobody connected the deaths because they occurred at different plantations under different circumstances. Some were attributed to cholera, others to malaria, several to yellow fever, a few to heart problems or other ailments. The common factor, that a beautiful woman had visited each man shortly before his death, was invisible because white women, especially wealthy married white women, were simply not suspects for serial poisoning. The very impossibility of the crime made it perfect. But Elizabeth was beginning to see effects. The Adams County Planters Association meeting in October 1840 included complaints from multiple plantation owners about difficulty finding reliable overseers, about the unusual mortality rate among supervisory staff, about increasing incidents of slaves attempting to escape or resisting discipline. The surveillance system was starting to crack. With 13 fewer overseers watching 12,000 enslaved people, gaps were appearing. Times when no white men were present to enforce immediate violence. Moments when enslaved people could move without being observed. Opportunities for small acts of resistance that would have been impossible under complete surveillance. The mathematics were working. Each dead overseer reduced total supervision by approximately 0.5%. But those 0.5% were accumulating into meaningful change. By January 1841, Elizabeth had killed 19 overseers. The count in her journal read 19 to 47, and she was exactly on track for completion by mid-1842. But she was also exhausted. 19 sexual encounters with men she despised, 19 careful poisonings that required perfect execution to avoid suspicion. 19 deaths she'd caused, and then watched as doctors diagnosed natural causes. The psychological toll was significant. She found herself detaching from reality at times, struggling to remember which lies she'd told to which people, fighting the urge to simply stop and accept that 19 was enough, even though her calculations showed clearly that 47 deaths were required to achieve system collapse. Then something unexpected happened. On February 14, 1841, a 20-year-old enslaved man named Jacob attempted to escape from Willowbrook Plantation during a gap in overseer coverage caused by Samuel Briggs's death 3 months earlier. Jacob ran north toward the Mississippi River, hoping to steal a boat and float downstream to New Orleans, where he might lose himself in the city's large population of free black people. He was caught after 14 miles by slave catchers using dogs. But the significant detail was that he'd gotten 14 miles, farther than any attempted escape in Adams County in 5 years. The slave catchers who returned him noted in their report that supervision at Willowbrook appeared inadequate, that the plantation's remaining overseers were stretched too thin to maintain proper surveillance. Elizabeth read about Jacob's attempted escape in the Natchez newspaper, which reported such incidents as warnings to other enslaved people about the futility of running. But what Elizabeth read between the lines was proof that her plan was working. 14 miles represented a surveillance gap that wouldn't have existed with full overseer staffing. Jacob's attempt was the first visible crack in the control system. More would follow as Elizabeth continued reducing the number of men enforcing that system. By the time she reached 47 deaths, those cracks would become chasms wide enough for hundreds of people to escape through. She killed 3 more overseers in March 1841. Rapid work that pushed her count to 22 to 47 and brought her closer to the midpoint of her operation. But the accelerated pace meant increased risk. Doctors were starting to notice the unusual mortality rate among plantation overseers, though they still attributed it to disease clusters rather than deliberate poisoning. A physician named Dr. Samuel Harrison published a letter in the Natchez Gazette in April 1841, wondering whether some environmental factor, perhaps contaminated water sources or disease-carrying mosquitoes, was causing elevated death rates among overseers specifically. The letter concluded with a recommendation that plantation owners ensure their overseers practiced good sanitation and avoided drinking from suspect water sources. Elizabeth read Harrison's letter and understood she needed to slow down slightly. Let enough time pass between deaths that patterns became less visible. She also needed to vary her methods occasionally. Couldn't rely exclusively on arsenic poisoning, or doctors might start testing for it. In May 1841, she poisoned an overseer named William Kowalski with foxglove extract instead of arsenic. The plant grew wild in the woods around Rosewood, contained digitalis that caused heart failure symptoms indistinguishable from natural cardiac problems. Kowalski died after 3 days of chest pain and shortness of breath. The doctor attributed his death to heart disease, never suspected poisoning. Elizabeth made a note in her journal. Alternative methods viable. Can rotate between arsenic, foxglove, others to maintain pattern invisibility. By September 1841, 2 years into her operation, Elizabeth had killed 28 overseers. Her journal showed 2847, and she was ahead of her original schedule by approximately 4 months. The surveillance system in Adams County was visibly degrading. Plantation owners were complaining openly at association meetings about difficulty maintaining control, about slaves being uppity or difficult, about the need to increase patrols and enforcement. What they didn't understand was that their enforcement system was being systematically dismantled by the beautiful woman sitting across from them at dinner, the wife who smiled pleasantly while discussing charitable works and proper flower arrangements, while secretly planning which overseer to poison next. The physical toll on Elizabeth was severe by this point. 28 sexual encounters with men she found repulsive. 28 careful poisonings requiring perfect execution. 28 deaths she'd caused and then pretended to mourn at funerals. She'd developed a dissociative response where she could separate her consciousness from her body during sex, could perform the necessary physical actions while her mind went somewhere else entirely. This allowed her to continue functioning, but at a cost. She was losing touch with normal human connection, struggling to feel anything except the mission she'd committed to. Her husband noticed she'd become more distant, more coldly polite rather than warmly submissive. Henry attributed it to women's hysteria or melancholy. Never suspected his wife was conducting a systematic assassination campaign against the social order he profited from. December 1841 brought an unexpected complication. An overseer named Charles Whitmore at Riverside Plantation, scheduled to be Elizabeth's 29th victim, became sick before she could poison him. Actual cholera, not arsenic-induced symptoms. He died on December 18, 1841, technically advancing Elizabeth's count to 29 to 47, without requiring her direct action. But Whitmore's death from actual cholera created an investigation when Dr. Harrison examined the body and found genuine cholera bacteria in the intestinal tissue. Harrison's subsequent report noted that Whitmore was the first confirmed cholera case he'd examined among the recent overseer deaths, suggesting that perhaps other deaths attributed to cholera might actually have been caused by something else. Elizabeth read Harrison's report in January 1842 and understood she was running out of time. If Harrison or other doctors started performing detailed autopsies on overseer deaths, they might detect arsenic or other poisons in tissue samples. She needed to accelerate her operation, complete the remaining 18 deaths quickly before medical scrutiny made it impossible to continue. Between January and June 1842, she killed 16 more overseers, nearly 3 per month, the fastest pace yet. The deaths were attributed to various causes: cholera, malaria, yellow fever, heart disease, pneumonia. But the sheer number occurring in a concentrated time period was starting to trigger alarm among plantation owners and county authorities. By July 1842, Elizabeth's count stood at 45 to 47, and she was exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. 45 men dead by her hand, 45 sexual encounters endured, 45 careful poisonings executed perfectly. The surveillance system in Adams County was collapsing visibly. Plantation owners were unable to hire replacement overseers because word had spread that working as an overseer in Adams County was somehow dangerous, despite nobody understanding why. The enslaved population was testing the weakened surveillance system with increased resistance and escape attempts. In June 1842 alone, 17 enslaved people successfully escaped from various plantations in Adams County, a number that would have been impossible under normal supervision levels. Elizabeth had 2 more targets to eliminate to reach her goal of 47 deaths. The first was a man named Daniel Crawford at Fairview Plantation, 10 miles south of Rosewood. She visited Crawford on July 19, 1842, delivered poisoned wine disguised as celebration of her husband's recent cotton sales. Crawford died on July 27th. The second target was Thomas Pierce at Elmwood Plantation, 8 miles west. Elizabeth poisoned Pierce on August 4, 1842. He died on August 11th. Her journal entry for that date read simply, 4747, complete. Below that, she wrote a longer entry. August 11th, 1842. Operation finished. 47 overseers deceased across Adams County. Surveillance system critically degraded. Mass escapes now possible. Awaiting results. The results came faster than Elizabeth anticipated. On August 23, 1842, the largest slave escape in Mississippi history began when 127 enslaved people from 7 different plantations in Adams County fled simultaneously toward the Mississippi River, using coordinated timing that exploited gaps in overseer surveillance. They moved at night, traveling in groups of 15 to 20, following routes that avoided roads and plantations with remaining overseers. Slave catchers attempted pursuit, but were overwhelmed by the number and coordination of the escapes. By August 28th, approximately 80 of the 127 escapees had successfully reached the Mississippi River and were believed to be traveling north toward free states. That first mass escape triggered more. Between September and December 1842, An estimated 800 enslaved people escaped from Adams County plantations, approximately 6.7% of the total enslaved population in the county. An unprecedented loss that devastated the region's cotton economy. Plantation owners held emergency meetings, demanded military intervention, offered rewards for information about who had organized the escapes. Federal marshals investigated, interviewed plantation staff, examined the circumstances that had allowed so many people to flee simultaneously. Their report, published in January 1843, concluded that the unusually high mortality rate among plantation overseers between 1839 and 1842 had created critical gaps in surveillance that enslaved people had exploited. The report recommended hiring more overseers and implementing stricter patrol systems. It never mentioned Elizabeth Marlowe, because nobody suspected that a wealthy white woman might be systematically murdering the enforcement mechanisms of slavery. Elizabeth stood in her bedroom on December 31st, 1842, reading newspaper accounts of the ongoing escape crisis, knowing that somewhere to the north, approximately 800 people who'd been enslaved in Adams County were now traveling toward freedom because she'd killed 47 men who'd been watching them. The knowledge should have brought satisfaction, but what she felt instead was emptiness. 47 men dead. 47 times she'd used her body as a weapon, offering sex to gain trust, then delivering poison disguised as wine. 800 people freed. But at what cost to herself? She'd become something she could barely recognize, not quite human anymore. More like a mechanism designed to convert sexual manipulation and poison into reduced surveillance and increased freedom for others. Henry called from downstairs. Dinner was ready. Elizabeth closed her journal, locked it away, and prepared to descend to the dining room where she would smile at her husband and discuss the unfortunate slave escapes that were damaging their cotton business. She would play the role of concerned plantation mistress, worried about property loss. Nobody would ever know that she'd caused those losses deliberately, that every escaped person represented success in a campaign nobody else understood had been fought. Elizabeth Marlowe, mass murderer and liberator, walked downstairs to eat dinner and pretend everything was normal while outside 800 people ran toward freedom, and 47 dead men rotted in graves across Adams County, killed by a woman nobody suspected, and a bottle of wine everyone thought was just wine. The crystal wine decanter sat on the evidence table in the Adams County Courthouse on March 15, 1843, surrounded by other items seized from Elizabeth Marlowe's bedroom during her arrest 2 weeks earlier. Beside the decanter lay a leather journal containing 47 entries, each recording a name, date, method, and outcome. A glass vial that had once contained white arsenic powder. A second vial with dried foxglove extract. Letters from overseers arranging secret meetings. And a detailed map of Adams County with red marks indicating every plantation where an overseer had died between September 1839 and August 1842. The prosecution had laid out Elizabeth's entire operation in physical form, transforming 3 years of invisible murder into visible evidence that horrified the 200 spectators packed into the courtroom to witness the trial of the century. Elizabeth sat in the defendant's chair, wearing a plain gray dress, her hair pinned severely back, her hands folded in her lap with a calmness that unnerved everyone watching. She was 31 years old, had been married for 14 years, and had systematically murdered 47 men while maintaining the appearance of a respectable plantation wife. The prosecutor, a man named Thomas Caldwell from Natchez, stood before the jury of 12 white men and began his opening statement by holding up the journal. "Gentlemen of the jury, what you are about to hear will challenge everything you believe about the gentler sex, about the sanctity of Southern womanhood, about the nature of evil itself. This woman, this creature who appears so calm and refined, used her body as bait and poison as her weapon to commit the most extensive murder campaign in Mississippi history. The path to Elizabeth's arrest had begun not with brilliant detective work, but with simple bad luck. On February 12, 1843, a plantation owner named Robert Sutherland was organizing his late brother's papers at Magnolia Grove Plantation when he discovered a letter hidden in a desk drawer. The letter was from his brother James, who had died in May 1841 from what doctors had diagnosed as heart failure. The letter, dated May 3, 1841, was addressed to a friend in Natchez and described a recent encounter with the most beautiful woman I have ever bedded, the wife of a wealthy planter who came to me in the night bearing wine and promises. James had never mailed the letter, had hidden it instead, perhaps recognizing the danger of documenting an affair with another man's wife. But the letter's existence proved that Elizabeth Marlowe had visited James Sutherland 4 days before his death, had brought him wine, had engaged in sexual relations with him. Robert Sutherland brought the letter to County Sheriff William Hayes on February 14th, asking whether his brother's death might warrant investigation. Hayes initially dismissed it. Wealthy women didn't murder overseers, and James Sutherland's death certificate clearly stated heart failure as cause of death. But Sutherland persisted, pointing out that Elizabeth's visit occurred suspiciously close to James's death. Hayes agreed to make discreet inquiries. He visited Magnolia Grove's remaining overseers, asked if they'd seen Mrs. Marlowe visiting James Sutherland. 2 men confirmed they'd seen her arrive at Sutherland's cottage around 8 p.m. on May 3rd, carrying a tray with wine, had seen her leave approximately 90 minutes later. Hayes began checking other overseer deaths, asking plantation staff whether they'd seen Elizabeth Marlowe visiting any of the deceased men before they died. The pattern emerged within a week. At least 12 overseers who died between 1839 and 1842 had been visited by Elizabeth Marlowe in the days before their deaths. Always at night, always carrying wine, always alone. The visits had seemed unremarkable at the time. Plantation owners' wives occasionally brought food or drink to employees, especially during holidays or after good harvests. But the concentration of visits preceding deaths was statistically impossible to explain as coincidence. Hayes obtained a warrant to search Rosewood Plantation on February 28, 1843. He arrived with 6 deputies, informed Henry Marlowe that his wife was under investigation for multiple murders, and proceeded to search Elizabeth's bedroom over her husband's outraged protests. They found the journal within 15 minutes, locked in Elizabeth's writing desk, but easily opened once deputies broke the lock. The journal contained everything: dates, names, methods, detailed notes about each victim's routine and vulnerabilities. Entry after entry, documenting systematic murder. September 17, 1839. Pritchard, established access, ready for implementation within 2 weeks, 147. October 6, 1839. Pritchard deceased. Cause attributed to cholera. No investigation. Method successful. 247 complete. 46 remaining. The journal entries continued through August 1842, ending with August 11, 1842. Operation finished. 47 overseers deceased across Adams County. Surveillance system critically degraded. Mass escapes now possible. Awaiting results. Hayes arrested Elizabeth immediately. The news spread through Adams County within hours. The plantation owner's wife, who'd murdered 47 overseers using sex and poison. The revelation shocked white society so completely that many refused to believe it initially. Women didn't do such things. Beautiful, refined, educated white women certainly didn't seduce men they intended to murder. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that several plantation owners insisted the journal must be a forgery, that Elizabeth was being framed by abolitionists or by enslaved people seeking to discredit the planter class. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The arsenic vial matched the batch stored in Rosewood's warehouse. The foxglove vial contained residue that matched plants growing wild on the property. Elizabeth's handwriting in the journal matched samples from her personal correspondence. And most damningly, when confronted with the evidence, Elizabeth didn't deny anything. Her first statement to Sheriff Hayes, recorded on March 1, 1843, was brief and direct. Every word in that journal is true. I killed 47 men between September 1839 and August 1842. I used arsenic, foxglove, and occasionally other substances. I seduced each man to gain private access, then poisoned them with wine or other beverages. My goal was to reduce overseer populations in Adams County to the point where the slave surveillance system would collapse, allowing mass escapes. 800 people escaped as a direct result of my actions. I consider the operation successful and have no regrets about any death I caused. The trial began on March 13, 1843. In a courthouse so packed with spectators that Sheriff Hayes had to station deputies at the doors to prevent overcrowding. The prosecution's case was straightforward. 47 counts of first-degree murder, each supported by journal entries, physical evidence, and witness testimony from plantation staff who'd seen Elizabeth visiting victims before their deaths. Caldwell, the prosecutor, spent 3 days presenting evidence, calling witness after witness who described seeing Elizabeth enter overseers' cottages at night, seeing her leave hours later, seeing those same men fall ill and die within days. The testimony was damning and relentless, building an overwhelming case that Elizabeth had systematically murdered dozens of men. But the defense strategy was even more shocking than the crimes themselves. Elizabeth's attorney, a man named Marcus Whitfield, who'd been appointed by the court when no other lawyer would take her case, didn't contest the facts. Instead, he argued justification based on the brutality of the slavery system Elizabeth had been fighting against. On March 16th, Whitfield called his first defense witness. Not a character witness for Elizabeth, but an escaped slave named Samuel, who'd fled Adams County during the August 1842 mass escape. Samuel had been captured in Tennessee and returned to Mississippi, where he was being held in the Natchez jail awaiting sale to a new owner. Whitfield had obtained permission to call Samuel as a witness, and what followed was testimony unlike anything ever heard in a Mississippi courtroom. Samuel took the stand shackled, guarded by 2 deputies, and described in calm, detailed language what life had been like under the overseers Elizabeth had killed. He testified about Jonathan Pritchard whipping a pregnant woman until she miscarried, about Marcus Webb beating a 12-year-old boy so severely the child's arm broke, about David Foster raping a 16-year-old girl in the cotton storage barn while other overseers watched and laughed, about Thomas Klein shooting a man in the leg for talking back, letting him bleed for 3 hours before calling a doctor, the leg eventually being amputated. Samuel's testimony lasted 4 hours and included specific graphic details about violence that made several jury members visibly uncomfortable. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, arguing that testimony about slavery's brutality was irrelevant to whether Elizabeth had committed murder. The judge sustained most objections, but allowed enough testimony to enter the record that the jury heard a fraction of what Samuel described. Whitfield called 6 more escaped slaves as witnesses over the next 2 days, each brought from jails where they'd been recaptured and held awaiting return